Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Chapter 9 study guide. We will be going through our two parts here. So part 1 will be side 1 here, and part 2 will be side 2. So starting off, notice how it does say no calculators. When we do take our test, we're actually going to be doing our side 2 first. We'll be doing it with a calculator, and then once your calculator is done with, then you'll be going to the other side, or vice versa. So we'll start with no calculators, and then you'll get your calculator. So we'll figure it out tomorrow. So starting with number 1, we have a square-based tent. So whenever you hear square-based, it's obviously going to be the shape of a square. And we know that the inside is 100 square feet. So really you're asking yourself, what number times itself is 100? And really the shortcut for that is if we can find the square root of 100, that will tell us what length is on each side of the square, because it has to be the same length. So I can guess and check, and I can say, well, I think, 7 times 7, well, 7 times 7 is 49, so that doesn't work, and I can keep guessing and checking until I get to my 100. Or you just take the square root of 100, and that gives us 10 feet on each side. Be sure you remember to put your label for that one. Number 2, it says, what two integers does the square root of 80 fall between? The square root of 80, when we are using this sheet that we got, we know that the square root of 80, if I look it up, falls somewhere between the square root of 64 and the square root of 81. And so these numbers right here, these are my integers. And so when it asks for integers, we have to say it's between this and this. So in this case, with the square root of 80, it falls between 8 and 9. So that's what you would put on this blank. So the number 8 and the number 9. Some of you may have put the square root of 64, but that's not an integer. That's a square root, and this would be the square root of 81. But the answer to the square root of 84 or 64 is 8. The answer to the square root of 81 is 9. So these are your two integers, 8 and 9 for number 2. On number 3, we need to do that little trick where we kind of do our little arms that kind of branch off. And I know that looking at my sheet that hopefully you'll use on your test, the square root of 48 falls somewhere between these two perfect squares. So I write those on my paper. I got the square root of 36 and the square root of 49. So I know it's going to fall between 6 and 7. I just have to figure out, how far. So 36 to 48 gives me a difference of 12 on that side. And then on this side over here, we're only 1 away. So it's actually really close to that side, so really close to that 7. And so be thinking of a decimal that's really close to that number. If you said approximately 6.8 or 6.9, you would have gotten credit for that. Because you're really close to the correct answer. I think the actual answer is around that 6.9 mark. All right, so number 3, be sure you're showing what you do, because if you don't show me your work here, you won't get credit for it. So be sure you do. Letter B, so 3B, 17. I use my sheet here. 17 falls between the square root of 16 and 25, so I know it will be between 4 and 5. So it's going to be 4 point something in the end. So I do my little branches, and then from there I write the square root of 16 over here, and the square root of 25 over here, and then I find the difference. The difference on this side is 1. The difference over here is 8. So it's really close to that side, and since I know the answer is 4 and this is 5, I know it'll be way closer to that 4 side. So, it's important that you get as close as you possibly can. So we're looking at around 4.1-ish. So around that mark, around 4.1. If you said 4.2, you probably did pretty well getting that estimate correct. So that means we're going on to the next question. This phone comes at a good time, doesn't it? So I will answer that so we can continue on our part 1 of our video, and we'll go from there. Number 3 is actually a nice perfect square. So if you look up 225, this is actually the last thing on our sheet. So 225 is exactly 15. So 15 is our answer exactly. You don't have anything that's approximate. It's exactly 15. So each of those would be a point. So you won't get your point though unless you show me your work on those 2 things. All right, on that note, you are going to go ahead and go to this next. It's just like the previous questions. We just have to figure out where on the number line you put all of these. So you do them the same as you did the ones up here. So we have to put a little branches. The square root of 1 is actually easy because that's a perfect square. That actually is the answer of exactly 1 right there. So I just draw a line to it. But the square root of 7 is not a perfect square. So I kind of do the little trick where I figure out, what 2 numbers does it fall between. And I know that the square root of 7 falls between the square root of 4 and the square root of 9. It's 3 away from this one. It's 2 away from this one. So it's a little closer to the number 3 because that's my answer. So it's between 2 and 3, but it's closer to 3. So we kind of get as close as we can. So maybe I'll draw my line a little bit past halfway, because remember, halfway is about 2.5. So if you kind of put your dot anywhere in between any of this area, you'll get credit for that one. So between 2 and 3, closer to the 3 side for that one. The exact answer is like up into around 2.8-ish. So if I take the actual square root, actually I was a little wrong, so it's 2.6, because that makes sense, because 3 and 2 are really close to each other, so it's almost halfway. So it's barely past halfway, around 2.6. Square root of 50 is between the square root of 49 and the square root of 64. It's 1 away on this side, but 14 away from that side. I know 49 is 7 and 64 is 8, and it's really close to that 7. So I'm going to find my 7, probably 0.1. So I'll kind of draw an arrow, or you can just say, okay, right here, just mark it. This is the square root of 50. So that's another way, is instead of drawing a line, since it's way over here, you can just say, put a little mark and say, yep, the square root of 50 is about right there. So that's another way you can do it. Square root of 34 is between the square root of 25 and the square root of 36. This is 9 away, and this is 2 away. So it's going to be closer to the number 6. So it's going to be 5 point something, but closer to the 6. So when you're actually doing that one, you want to, as long as you're within 1/10, you'll be okay. That's around 5.8, and since that's right there, I'm going to draw an arrow to about 5.8 for my square root of 34. Square root of 13 is between the square root of 9 and the square root of 16. So it's 4 away from 13, and 16 is 3 away from 13. So this is almost in the middle. It's just barely past this. The square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 16 is 4. So we know it's between 3 and 4. It's a little bit closer to the 4, but not by much. So I'm going to go down here to my middle point. Here's my middle point, but I have to go a little bit past that. So that'll be where my square root of 13 is for that one. So make sure you either, once again, you mark it on the number line by drawing a line, or you just can mark it and then just put that square root above it. All right. All right, next section, we have some of our vocabulary that we've had. And this one was a little tough because when we get down to a rational number, many of these are rational. So I actually recommend doing that one last. The only prime number that's on here is actually letter A. So remember, a prime means that we have two factors that go into it, 1 and itself. And 1 can go into 7, and 7 can go into 7. So it's just two factors exactly. So that is a prime number. So that's letter A. So I got rid of that one. A composite number. The only composite number I have on here is 6. Technically, B could be a composite number because the square root of 144 is 12, and 12 is composite. So I'm going to go ahead and use my number 6 though. So that's letter F. Irrational, I told you on some of our notes, the only irrational one here is pi, so that is letter C. Some people think a square root is always irrational, but because that comes out to be a whole number, that's not an irrational number. Rational, I said wait for last. Terminating decimal less than 1 is actually 3/4 because when we find the decimal for that, that's actually 0.75. So that's a decimal that stops and it's less than 1, therefore it's letter D. Non-terminating repeating is 2/3 because this is 0.6 repeating. It goes on forever. So because of that, it doesn't stop and it repeats with that 0.6 on forever. So that's letter E. So that leaves us with 1 left, which is B, a rational number, square root of 144, which makes sense because it's just the number 12. So make sure you have those. And once again, you got to kind of narrow it down because a few of these, that composite number and that rational have multiple answers. Rational could have been most of these, that would be rational number, but only one works per category. You can only use each example one time, so you should be able to narrow it down. All right, last but not least, we've got our 6 and our 7. 6 is actually really easy. We just take the square root of both sides, and when we do that, it gets rid of our power. So we're left with x equals the square root of 121, which is 11. So that's actually a perfect square, which makes things pretty easy. 7's a little bit more tricky, and we can't use a calculator, so we're going to have to estimate this final square root. It won't be a nice even number. The first thing I'm going to do is subtract 5 from both sides because I'm going to undo this, the opposite of PEMDAS. So we go SADMAP, I should say. And so we're eliminating that addition. So I do that on both sides, and I'm left with 3x squared equals 99. So then, before I get rid of my power, I have to get rid of this 3. And since that's being multiplied by 3, I have to divide both sides by 3. So when I do that, I end up getting x squared by itself equals 99 divided by 3, which is 33. So now we just have to take the square root of both sides. So when I do that, I actually get an answer. If you set an estimate, because if I do that little estimation trick with our little branches, I end up getting an estimate of around 5.8 or 5.7 would probably been, either one of those is a pretty good estimate for it. So make sure you're, once again, rounding to the nearest 10th, and that's why I gave the 10th right here, is we estimated that. All right, so make sure you kind of stop at each question, review it if you need to, and then we'll go ahead and go on to part 2.